Funding for the Maddy Report is made possible by grants from the California Emerging Technology Fund, leaders in the quest for digital equity. The James Irvine Foundation, committed to a California where all low-income workers have the power to advance economically. Fresno State Associated Students, Inc., students serving students. BNSF Railway, moving our economy for 160 years. And The Wonderful Company. The Maddy Report is also made possible thanks to contributions from Harris Ranch Inn and Restaurant and E&J Gallo Winery. From the Maddy Institute, the Public Policy Institute for the Valley's 4 public universities, this is the Maddy Report with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Keppler.
Welcome. In 2008, California voters rejected gerrymandering and gave an independent Citizens Review Commission the authority to draw district lines for California state legislative districts as well as congressional districts. The commission did its work initially in 2010, and now after the 2020 census, they're back at it again. Our guest is a member of that commission, Pedro Toledo. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thank you.
So let me ask you, it sounds kind of dry, redistricting. Why should our audience care?
Well, redistricting is the process of redrawing the lines of districts from which public officials are elected. It happens typically every 10 years following the census, and it impacts which voters, which members of Congress, state and local legislatures, and other elected officials. It impacts their districts, and when done improperly, it can result in partisan gerrymandering, minority vote dilution, and districts that favor incumbents.
Yeah, I was doing some reading on this, and they talk about the issue of, that was interesting, cracking and packing. And the best way to describe cracking and packing, cracking is when you split the voters up among a lot of districts so they have no input. And packing is when you concentrate the voters all in one district so they only have really a voice in one district, not in multiple districts. So that's the things that you're kind of addressing and dealing with. Can you briefly talk about the redistricting process? I mean, who's on the commission? How are they selected? That kind of thing.
There are 14 commissioners on the California Redistricting Commission. 5 of them are registered Republicans, 5 are registered Democrats, and 4 of us are declined to state. We're from different parts of the state and have different experiences and backgrounds, and it's an honor to serve with my colleagues who are all committed to ensuring fair maps for Californians. Over 20,000 people submitted an initial application to serve on the commission.
Wow.
And those who met the qualifications were reviewed by an applicant review panel consisting of 3 independent auditors from the California State Auditor's Office. And after the panel reviewed all applicants, the panel selected 120 of the most qualified applicants who were then personally interviewed and divided into 3 equal subpools according to party affiliation. And that pool was then narrowed to 60. The panel presented those 60 applicants to the California State Legislature, where the leadership had the option of removing up to 24 names from the list, and 8 from each subpool. From there, the California State Auditor's Office randomly drew from the names that were remaining 3 subpool, 3 Democrats, 3 Republicans, and 2 from the declined to state category. And those 8 became the first 8 members of the commission, and those 8 then selected the final 6.
Wow, that is one complicated, very selective process, but very complicated process to ensure fairness. Let me ask you this. So you're going to sit down, you've got your commission together, you now got to decide how you're going to put these maps together. What are the criteria you're using?
When drawing district maps, we have to follow federal and state law, and the districts must be of equal proportion to comply with the U.S. Constitution. The districts must comply with the Voting Rights Act to ensure that minorities have an equal opportunity to elect representatives of their choice. Districts must be drawn contiguously so that all parts of the districts are connected to one another. Districts must minimize the division of cities, counties, neighborhoods, and communities of interest to the extent possible. And districts must be geographically compact, such that nearby areas of population are not bypassed for a more distant population.
Yeah, you don't want to run these kind of squirrely kind of maps. And I think also you want to nest, you said, I guess the state Senate districts, the 2 assembly districts into the Senate district where possible. So
That's right.
okay. So it seems the focus really is, the key term is communities of interest. And so can you give a quick example of communities of interest?
Well, a quick example would be that of, I live in Petaluma, California, out in Sonoma County. We've had quite a few wildfires in the last couple of years. So those communities where there is high fire risk may share similar interests and may want to come together for the purposes of seeking representation in terms of ensuring that they have adequate public and health, public safety issues to respond for those fires. So they share similar interests and may want to elect individuals who will represent those interests.
Right. So there's going to be a difference between a rural district and an urban district. Well, I want to thank you for explaining that complicated process to us. Up next, we're going to talk about the nuts and bolts of implementing all these maps and plans. That conversation in a moment. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. California's redistricting efforts are tied to the census. Unfortunately, because of the pandemic, the usual rules that guide the census had to be changed, and therefore redistricting, the timing had to be modified. Our guest is Alvaro Hernandez. He's the executive director of the Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission, and he's tasked with making sure everything comes off without a hitch, which is going to be, sounds like a little more difficult, challenging this year than in past. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thank you so much for having me, Mark. I appreciate it very much.
So, Alvaro, I want to ask you, the pandemic has caused some delays in the census that in turn has changed the timeline for the redistricting. What's the timeline look like now?
Well, the timeline has expanded. Originally, we had it to December 31st was the extended timeline. But since then, it's now moved to possibly February 15th because the Supreme Court added however many days after the original due date to submit the maps is what we would be allocated. So if we're 30 days late, then it would be 30 days. But if we're 60 days, then it would be 60 days. So we're right around February 15th or so.
Yeah, so we're right around Valentine's Day. I guess it's the easy way to remember that. So you guys are doing all kinds of outreach. Can you give me an example of kinds of outreach you're doing?
Well, one of the things that we're doing is we're sending out information to different community-based organizations. And likewise, a lot of our commissioners are actually doing redistricting basics presentations to these community-based organizations to give them information about what is redistricting and how do they go about providing input, defining their communities of interest and what vehicles are available now, given the pandemic and all, for them to provide their input to the commission. So we've been very active. We'll be putting out additional information on our website at wedrawthelineca.org for people to go and get information on how they can provide the public input. They can send us emails. There's also a new tool called the COI input tool, Community of Interest Input Tool, that they can use to describe their community and also draw maps. So that's something new that we didn't have in the previous commission in 2010.
Yeah, the community of interest thing, that's I won't say it's a big issue, it's the issue, isn't it?
It is. It definitely is. So that tool that we now have allows people to draw and give parameters of what their district is. So it helps in drawing of the maps, providing us that input. Sorry.
Yeah. And so if people want to participate, what do they do? Let's spell it out for them specifically.
Absolutely. So the first thing that they can do is attend our meetings. We have meetings and we have them published on our website. They can listen in to what's going on. We will have outreach presentations available for them to view. We also will have public input meetings coming up. We're still working on that piece of it, but as soon as we have that information, we're going to have these live stream public input meetings where they can call in and provide input, or they can submit their email, or they can submit the COI, the Community of Interest tool maps directly to the tool.
Yeah, and we'll make sure that at the Maddy Institute, we'll make sure that we get that message out to folks so they can have some input, because that's really important. Let me ask you
Great.
this though. Last question about
Sure.
legal challenges. It seems that legal challenges, whoever doesn't like the way the district is drawn, they're going to file a legal claim. Well, is that likely to happen, frankly? And then second, if it does happen, then what?
Well, it is likely to happen. At the previous commission, that did happen as well. It is the nature of what it is. Different people want to see different maps, so that is a vehicle that they can use. Now, the one of the things that the California Constitution allows is for it to go straight to the Supreme Court rather than go through a lot of the other process where it takes a lot longer, because that information, the maps themselves, have to be out, and the decisions have to be made before the next general election. So the timing is very important, but we have the vehicle available for them to process this and go directly to the Supreme Court, the California Supreme Court.
You have an expedited process. Well, that's good.
Absolutely.
Well, I want to thank the Executive Director of the Citizens Redistricting Commission, Alvaro Hernandez, for joining us. Up next, what about the timeline, the change timeline, and what impact is that going to have on the upcoming races? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. The pandemic-induced delays in the census have caused a secondary impact on the ability of the Citizens Redistricting Commission to do its work in a timely manner. What does that mean for the 2020 elections? Our guest is an expert on elections, Eric McGee, with the non-partisan California Public Policy Institute of California. Welcome to the Maddy Report.
Thank you for having me.
So, Eric, I want to ask you, absent the pandemic, what would the timeline have been? What happened 10 years ago?
Yeah, so there's basically 3 steps to the redistricting process. The first is the census has to collect the data. The Census Bureau collects the data. That 10 years ago and normally would finish around August. Then the Census Bureau provides to the president by December 31st the total population counts for each state. That's for reapportionment, what they call reapportionment, which is where you, based on the population changes from the previous 10 years, you adjust how many congressional districts each state gets. Then, over the next 4 months on a rolling basis, every state would receive, and did receive 10 years ago, its special redistricting file, which is a very detailed data file that contains the information necessary to redraw district boundaries within the state. California 10 years ago got that file on March 8th. So this time around, the pandemic delayed the data collection process for the Census Bureau. And so they didn't even finish getting the data together until mid-October. And now they're talking about delivering the total population counts to the president by sort of mid-late April. And then giving everybody all at once, instead of on a rolling basis, giving everybody all at once their redistricting files by the end of September. So it's quite a considerable delay based on compared to 10 years ago.
Yeah, like seven months later. So let me ask you this. So the California Supreme Court has stepped in using its emergency powers and said, we're going to adjust the timeline as needed. It looks like right now the commission has until New Year's Day of 2022 to draw up the maps, and probably about Valentine's Day to do the final maps. What does that mean in practical terms for candidates?
Well, so in California, the filing deadline, so if you want to run for office, you have to file to run for office by basically 3 months before the election. Now, originally, the primary election in California was scheduled for March of 2022. So 3 months prior to that, and you're already too early, essentially, for all these delays that have been taking place. So the legislature moved the primary to be in June instead. That still makes things kind of tight because, as you say, the redistricting commission now has until basically mid-February to draw the lines, and that's only about a month before the filing deadline. So candidates need to know what those districts look like before they know whether it makes sense for them to run for office, before they can go to their supporters and kind of make a case for their candidacy. So that doesn't give them a whole lot of time to do that sort of spade work before they decide to file. So we're already kind of really bumping up against that deadline. So we really got to hope that things don't get delayed any further.
Yeah, and you want to know the district where you're running, right? I mean, that seems kind of obvious, and it sounds like you've only got about a month to figure that out. Do I want to run? Which is, I think you said the last time was like they had like 7 months.
Yeah, 7 months.
Yeah, a lot more time to pull your supporters together, decide if you want to run or not. So it's on an expedited timeline for sure. Any implications for the recall effort with Governor Newsom?
Yeah, well, the funny thing is that you wouldn't think necessarily would affect the recall because there's no redistricting involved there. But the fact that the primary got moved did affect the recall in a kind of funny way. So the recall has a certain schedule of its own. Right now, that schedule looks like the recall is going to be sometime in October, November, December timeframe. If that recall had been scheduled for within 180 days of the next statewide election, which again is the primary, then they could be consolidated together, and Newsom would have had even more time to prepare for this recall effort. The fact that it's now the primary had to be moved to June because of all these redistricting and census count delays, it means that they're outside that 180-day window and they can't consolidate those elections together. And so the recall is going to happen at the end of this year.
And this is all assuming that nothing else goes wrong. I want to thank Eric McGee with the Public Policy Institute of California for joining us. Up next, the Redistricting Commission was supposed to change the way politics were conducted in California. Has it? That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. I'm Mark Keppler with the Maddy Institute. Dan Walters, the well-read columnist with CalMatters, is back with us to talk about the California Redistricting Commission. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Thank you, Mark. Nice to talk again.
So Dan, theoretically, removing gerrymandering from the redistricting process was supposed to make these elections more competitive. Did that happen?
Well, no, but mostly because of other factors that came into being, mainly the almost collapse of the Republican Party and the dominance of the Democratic Party in California. I don't think it made them unfair, but it didn't have the outcomes that some of the supporters of independent redistricting hoped for because of these other factors. The other thing you have to remember is that during that first round of redistricting by an independent commission a decade ago, they essentially had to make up for 20 years of demographic change, not just 10 years, because after the 2000 census, there was a gerrymander, a bipartisan gerrymander that basically froze the partisan status quo in the legislature and in the congressional delegation. And so that gerrymander ignored the socioeconomic / demographic changes that had occurred in the 1990s. So the 2010 redistricting by the commission had to take into account 20 years of change, not just 10 years of change. And the result was positive for the Democrats, because in the meantime, they had become a more dominant party over that last 20 years, and also positive for what used to be called minorities, ethnic groups, vis-a-vis whites, because that had also been ignored over by the gerrymander after by the 2000 census redistricting. So it was not really a fair test in a way of what changes the Redistricting Commission brought to it. That said, I think that 10 years ago, I think it did reflect basically the demographic changes of the previous 20 years.
Well, let me ask you this. So the idea was, proponents said that, listen, redistricting, taking it out of the hands of the legislature, giving it this independent citizens redistricting commission would have beneficial impacts on the legislative process. It's going to make it, increase compromise, it'll decrease political polarization, and improve civility. Was that oversold?
It improved stability because the Democrats took over everything. So that's a very stable situation, a one-party rule. So that certainly is true. Now, you remember that the arguments made to the voters over a measure aren't necessarily reflective of what the proponents truly hoped would occur because of that. But it's probably an improvement over what we had before, which was the legislature drawing its own seats and those of congressional districts as well. Now, I think it's very ironic to note today, because of what's happened in other states, the Democratic Party is saying is all for independent commissions doing redistricting. But back then in California, when this was the voters in the 2000s, late in the 2000s, Democratic Party strongly opposed that measure, going to an
pretty
redistricting commission.
Yeah, and that's it. So let me ask you this.
And obviously we campaigned against it. And the initial measure applied to the legislature, and later there was a second measure that applied to this, and that really set off Nancy Pelosi, the Democrats, saying it was a Republican power grab. So, yet the Democrats actually wound up gaining out of the redistricting that they opposed.
Well, let me ask you this. After 10 years of this, have we learned anything from the redistricting commission? Positive, negative, unintended consequences? What's the takeaway?
That the redistricting commission is less likely to deal with partisan issues, although there's a certain amount of that as well. More interested in communities of interest, ethnic communities and social communities such as LGBT communities and that sort of thing. They're more interested in having districts that reflect those kinds of measures rather than partisan measures per se. And I think that will continue on the redistricting will begin sometime this year. The census data is released. There will be more concern about those issues than of partisan issues. However, that said, simply because of the way the numbers roll out, the Democrats will probably benefit again from this next round of redistricting. It's almost like an inevitable.
Yeah, it sounds like the interest groups are going to have more conflict in interest groups intra-party than inter-party between Republicans and Democrats. I want to thank Dan Walters, as usual. Great commentary. We really appreciate it. We also want to thank Eric McGee from the Public Policy Institute of California, and Pedro Toledo and Alvaro Hernandez from the Citizens Redistricting Commission. And thank you for joining us. I'm Mark Keppler, and this is the Maddy Report. The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect the views of the Maddy Institute. If you'd like to share your thoughts about today's episode of the Maddy Report, please visit our website at maddyinstitute.org. If you want to stay up to date on state and local politics, you can sign up for our free e-newsletter, the Maddy Daily, by logging on to our website at maddyinstitute.org.